are some things that don't change. From generation to generation, century to century, millennia to millennia, they stay exactly straight. The only way that that can occur is if the same being is in charge of that thing. The Nephilim class being is the only being on this planet that has that kind of lifespan. Now, there aren't very many of them. The records say there are 200, but there may be less than that. Some may be in prison, some may be out of power, some may be incapacitated in some way. So there's even less than 200 trying to influence a population of 7 billion, maybe 8 billion. So could they themselves, their full 12-foot non-human selves, step forward in front of the microphone on CNN and tell the world what to do? No, absolutely could not happen. A, we wouldn't follow it. B, it wouldn't obey the rules. Okay, we don't allow aliens to step forward and rule the world. But we could allow them to stay back in the shadows. We could call certain world leaders into the back room, let them meet this Nephilim. But that power that you talk about, that ruled this world for 5,000 years, they want it back. They want their world back, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. As I said, we've already fought wars. We've already lost millions of people, and they still have not won. Lucifer and his followers were originally in the Garden of Eden separated from Higher Adam. You'll recall this argument that Lucifer had with God after he was called out, like, hey, what did you do to Eve? Eve immediately confesses, says, look, this is what happened. And so God said, all right, I'm going to try to clean up this mess. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to crawl on your belly for the rest of your days and eat dust. And that didn't sit too well. So he said, well, if you do that, if you curse me for the same thing that we do on every single world, then I'm going to take all the bodies that you make for Adam and Eve, and I'm going to possess them. And then God in the Bible, in Genesis, takes this amazing step. He creates what he calls enmity. He says, I will put enmity between thee and the seed of the woman. He'll have power. You'll have power to bruise his heel, and he'll have power to crush your head. In other words, it's our choice as to whether you take us or not. But I'm saying somehow, you're right, somehow Lucifer figured out how to get his spirits into physical bodies on this planet. I don't know exactly when it was done, but I can tell you, evil is born on this world. It is born evil. It grows up evil as a child. It is an evil young man. It is an evil adult. They enjoy hurting other people. They receive elation out of death and rape and murder and pain. And that is what we're fighting in this world right now. Society has changed. Now what we have is uninstitutionalized education. Now we have smart people, smart kids that are driven by their own will to learn as much as they can. They're outstripping universities by the time they're in 10th grade. By the time they're 20, they're the most brilliant minds that have ever walked the face of the earth. They know more than Einstein. They know more than Newton ever thought about knowing. And what's going to happen is that knowledge is going to start manifesting in things our society can do. That power that has been trying to take control of the world for all these centuries is losing its grip. And we're seeing that battle right now between that new consciousness, that new, I hesitate to use the word evolved human being, because it's more of a mental generation, and what they had in mind for the rest of the world. We still see that old guard, that sixth term senator, or that sovereign that's been worn the crown for 40 years, still trying to hold control of the earth, but they're about to lose it because the internet is now not in the hands of millions of people, it's in the hands of billions of people. And that knowledge is going to change the earth forever.
Become a member on Patreon to get full access to all exclusive content. A few of the perks is the full-length ad-free video version of the interviews, face-to-face interviews, bonus shows, and behind-the-scenes footage. You will also receive the video interview way in advance before the audio-only interview gets dropped on all platforms. Sign up and become a member today for only $3 a month. The link is in the description.
I've been wanting that my whole life. The Agnew clan, as far as I have been able to research, goes back to about the year 695. Came from both France and from Ireland to the western side of Scotland, to a place called Stranraer. That is where Agnew Bay is located, on Agnew Crescent, overlooking Agnew Parkway. So we've been there a long, long time, and there's a castle there. It's not called the Agnew Castle, but it is called the Castle at Loch Na, which overlooks the lake. So I went there and tried to research into my ancestors, and they were the hereditary sheriffs of Galloway. So they were like the first line of defense for any invasion from the west. Now, most of the invasions, I think, happened on the east side, over in the near York. So you see a lot of movies about that because that's where the Brits used to land. But on the west side is where the Norse came in, and the Romans, and so it was the Agnews that stood and fought. And as a testament to that ability to be sort of the second to the last man standing, there aren't very many Agnews in the phone book. But we were involved in some pretty important events. And one of the things was we defended the castle at Rosslyn and the chapel at Rosslyn, which, according to the legend, is one of the places that the Ark of the Covenant was stored temporarily. So I kind of feel good about the hereditary sheriffs of Galloway at one time being in the defense of and the protection of the Ark of the Covenant. So that's where we come from.
So, when it comes to your birth trilogy, what inspired you to write these trilogies, and what is the intent or message you want to leave to the reader when it comes to these books?
That's a good question. I wrote a book years ago called Remembering the Future, The Physics of the Soul and Time Travel. And it sort of opened a way for me to look into the future, see things that I wanted to have happen or that I expected to happen, and then come back to the past, which was the present, and work on those things to make those things happen. So in 2011, I was on the radio giving an interview, and a person called me from Florida and said, "Hey, that was really a good interview. Why don't you write a screenplay about that? We'll make it into a film." I said, "I don't know how to write a screenplay." He said, "Well, go buy the software. You're a smart guy. Figure it out. I'll talk to you in about 6 months." So 6 months, I had the screenplay for Birth done. Bearth, kind of a play on words, about the end times, about how the earth was originally put together during the flood of Noah as a spirit earth and a temporal earth, sort of like us. We're a spirit matter and physical matter occupying one space at one time. And then one day in the future, toward the end times, those two are going to come apart. So that was the story. It was like a big screen sci-fi, full-on action adventure movie. And I won a couple of screenplay contests with it, and it kind of sat there. Didn't get it funded, didn't make it into a movie. I didn't know anything about making movies. And then in 2015, events started to happen that I had written in the screenplay, and it got me excited. So I opened it back up, reread it, and said, "My gosh, I can't let this screenplay just sit here. I've got to do something." So I did what I know how to do, and that's write. So the first book, Birth, Two Earths, One Race for Time, came out, and I just stayed in the chair. Within 6 months, the second book was out, and 8 months later, the third book was out. So now we had 1,100 pages out there. They were all bestsellers. People liked them. I added the audiobooks on top of that. People enjoyed what they called the birth journey. And yes, it's an action adventure story, but all the major events in it are real events. They really did happen. They really are going to happen. And it's also a deep spiritual experience because it touches on all of these big subjects that kind of have pushed humankind around for thousands of years and to which we aspire at this very moment. So now it's time to turn that Birth trilogy back into film. So instead of going for the big screen, we're going to go for the small screen.
And last night you mentioned Netflix. So is that something you can talk about right now?
Netflix, Hulu, Amazon TV, Apple TV, they are all looking for fresh content with a continuing story. They want to do not just one season or one film. They want something that will go for 2 or 3 or even 4 seasons. So we're writing currently 42 episodes of the Birth journey, the Birth trilogy. So it's going to be delivered as a full package. And hopefully, if we can get around the armored plating on the front of those organizations and actually speak to somebody, maybe this video will be part of that. We can get what I think is the greatest story ever told on film.
That's awesome. And definitely going to be looking forward towards that. A while ago, I was asking you about your lineage. So we're going to go back. How far back does the human race lineage, the origins, how far back are we looking at? I guess first I guess we can start with Adam and Eve. Now, were they the first humans here, or were they the first genetically modified or altered?
That's a good question. There are several records about this. Let's just talk about maybe the ancient writings at first. The ancient writings say that Adam was a constructed being. He was built. So the DNA that's used to make the genes, that's used to make the being, was engineered by a supreme being. And that once that physical body was done, the breath of life was breathed into him and he became a living man, a human. Maybe not mortal at that time, but he was a living human. It's arguable as to whether he even had a belly button because he was built that way. Eve is a little different story. Adam, having been on the earth for a long time, it says in the ancient writings, 1 full day. But that could have been 1,000 years, it could have been 10,000 years. He had to name all the animals on the earth, and I don't think that can be done in 1 day, so not one of our days. And so maybe it was a little longer period than that, at least for his world. And I say that, I'll explain in a moment what I mean by that. At the end of this day, or toward the end of this day, he is put back to sleep and a rib is taken from him. Obviously, living, biological material, bone marrow, haploid cells from the mitochondria. So another being is constructed for him, but this time as a fetus, as a zygote. Now that has to be placed in the womb of another being, gestated, born, nurtured, raised to womanhood, and then brought back to earth and introduced to Adam. Adam didn't receive a baby, he received a full grown woman. So now you're talking about at least 3 races that have been mentioned in the ancient writings that none of them are human, none of them are from here. So Eve is given to him, and then they finish out that day and begin into the next day. Adam has been given guidance, he's been given commandments, he's had a relationship almost face to face with the Creator during this time. He is a seasoned, mature, sovereign being. And then Lucifer comes to tempt him. Didn't get very far with Adam. Adam already had a set of rules, he already had habits, he already had personality that could not be swayed. Eve, on the other hand, had never received any of those commandments. She never had any of that face to face nurturing and friendship over time, and she doesn't have experience and maturity. So she is beguiled, and she ends up losing her immortal state. She falls to mortality. So she returns to Adam and basically says, I'm undone. This has happened. It's a subject of controversy as to what exactly did happen, but she said, I'm going to be cast out of the garden and you're going to be left alone. Now, Adam could have said at that point, I always think about the possibilities of things. He could have said, you know what? That's too bad. I really feel bad for you. Have fun out there and just wait for the next Eve to show up. But he didn't. Evidently, and this isn't written, I'm just saying because I go back and think about these things. He loved her so much, he said, I'll go with you. So he did. Now that is where the gene line of Adam, the higher human, the higher Adam, entered into the gene pool of humanity. Before that, humanity was here, but it's what the ancient writings call lower Adam. So higher Adam and lower Adam come together, and we today are the stratification of that genetic input.
So Adam had a separate, I guess, gene pool within him compared to Eve.
No, they were probably genetically identical. Somehow, and we can do this with mice and with fruit flies, we can take genetic material from one sex of one species and we can change the sex and have another being of that same species that's breedable with that species. Evidently, this is what happened at that time as well.
So some researchers have stated that Adam and Eve were actually two different species of humans here on Earth. What are your thoughts on that, Brooks? And I guess what they're saying is that just like Homo sapiens, there was an Adam, a race of Adams, and a race of Eves. Have you looked into that, or do you think it was actually two beings, one Adam and one Eve?
I know a little bit about genetics. I have some education in that area. It doesn't make a lot of biological sense to me that they would be two different races.
Yeah.
It is really not possible in our experience with biology, from bacteria all the way to advanced beings, for two different species to be able to breed and have children. Now, we can take, for instance, a horse and a donkey, and we can create a mule, but mules cannot have foals. The race stops right there because it's a hybrid. But other than these isolated examples, we really don't see nature doing this. So it doesn't make sense that it would happen with a higher order being like a human. I think Adam and Eve were genetically compatible with one another, and as it turns out, in their new fallen state, they were genetically compatible with the humans that were already on the earth from the first creation.
Okay, when it comes to, we were just talking about Adam and Eve. What about, you stated that there was life already present here on Earth. Now, how do you think, I might be asking you to speculate some, how do you think that life started here on Earth, the life before Adam and Eve? Do you think that was a product of natural evolution? Do you think that maybe we had uh, we had people that are gods that came here in the way ancient past? I'm talking about way before Adam and Eve, and maybe that was one of their first experiments, and that was one of their interventions way before Adam and Eve. Tell me your thoughts on that, Brooks. I know I maybe ask you to speculate some, but just tell me what your gut tells you. with all your research you have done?
Well, let me see if I can put it into kind of chronological order. One of the things that we like to do is explore, and we dig in the dirt, we dive in the sea, we take all kinds of samples, and sometimes we do it to prove or disprove hypotheses that we come up with. One of the hypotheses that we have had for a long time is this hypothesis called evolution. What we have found is lots of examples of a process called natural selection. This is good evidence that genes and the gene pairs in a being have evidently a range of proteins that they can make. And though that range of proteins is evidently decided based upon environmental stress, temperature, food supply, readiness of water, swings in the climate back and forth. And what happens is the gene pairs can make it. It turns out protein decisions based upon stress in the environment and even predation or disease. Let me give you a good example. A moth, a white moth and a black moth. Well, if you release an equal population of white moths and black moths, same species, just different colors, into, say, a beech forest with white bark, eventually what will happen is predation, birds and lizards and things like that, will eat the black moths because they show up on the white bark. The white moths are masked and so thus survive. So they have a survivability advantage because of that genetic trait. This is how natural selection works. Seeds instead of insects, water instead of ice. These kinds of things allow the gene pairs to go through a range of choices that they have to make proteins to create a survivability advantage. The advantage allows the species to propagate and continue. If it can't, extinction occurs. So what we have found as we dig into the dirt and go into layers of clay that we already know are 500,000 years, 5 million years old, 50 million years old, is we find evidence of previous life. We find bacteria, we find leaves, we find fossils, and some of those fossils are advanced. Sometimes we find even human or humanoid looking bodies. Some of these are 100,000, 200,000 years old. Well, when you have the anthropologists and the geologists arm wrestling over the age of that being, because the anthropologists are using carbon dating and saying, oh, no, this skeleton can't be any more than 20,000 years old. But you have the geologists saying, well, I'm sorry to say, but that layer of clay is 250,000 years old. Hard to say a 20,000-year-old being could lay down in a clay layer that's 200,000 years old undisturbed. So the scientists don't agree. What really gets amazing is when they find tools or jewelry or things that are obviously man-made, like a hammerhead or an axe handle or a bolt, something like that, that's 5 million years old, recovered out of a coal mine 6,000 feet deep. No possible way that came from modern society. So it tells us that there were ancient zeniths of advanced mankind or advanced humanoid type of beings on this planet. Where did they go? Were they driven into extinction? Was the environment so bad from a comet strike or a solar flare or an ice age that they were driven to other areas where they had to survive? Inside of mountains, under the surface of the earth, inside the earth, off planet, different stresses that forced these advanced races, if they were going to survive, they had to leave. They had to go somewhere. So this opens the range of possibilities for all kinds of other observations. One of those observations is naturally are we alone in the universe? And many people will just definitively say, yes, we are. This is it. All the humans that are here, this is it. But scientist in me says, you have no evidence, so you can't prove that. If you want to form the hypothesis and try to prove or disprove the hypothesis, then let's do some experiments and gather some data. Hence, here we are talking about the word evolution when there really is no evidence whatsoever to back evolution. There's no missing link. There's no horses that became dogs. There's no pigs that became dinosaurs. It's just not there. A species is a species is a species. So now you have to ask yourself the question, okay, so if all life on this planet didn't crawl forth from some primordial ooze, where did it come from? This is the question answered in the birth trilogy.
Well said, Brooks. Well said. How do you make a scientific approach with something whenever, let's say, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years ago, or even a couple million years ago? Because you and other people, researchers have talked about it, Michael Cremo being one. How do you make a scientific approach with something and a hypotheses whenever most technologies from that far would be gone, would be perished, would be, it would be hard to find things in writing, even things with things tablets. Those would probably be decayed and broken and over a million years. And even let's say there were cities that long ago, um, way before Atlantis or whatever, all that. Those possibly be under the ocean, because we know that the oceans have risen and fell throughout the centuries. But how do you make that approach, Brooks, whenever that it's hard? It will be hard for, I guess, things, for lack of a better term, to withstand the test of time from a million years ago.
Well, you really opened some great ideas here.
You opened up in me first whenever the way you was talking about that.
The scientific approach is pretty disciplined, although it's easy to get undisciplined about it. And that is that when we look at unknown situations, unknown evidence that we found, or a question comes up, the first thing we do is try to state the problem. What is it that we're trying to figure out? And then we create a hypothesis, some kind of statement that says this never happened, or this happened, or this is the reason for this, or some definite statement. The next step is to create experiments to gather data and test thoroughly the go or no-go of your hypothesis. Sometimes we form what's called a null hypothesis. We're actually trying to prove that something doesn't exist. So if we work very hard and we conduct the experiments, and those experiments can be repeated by others in the same science or in a closely related science, and you can't disprove it, then it makes the hypothesis true. That's called the null hypothesis. The key is in the experimentation, in the data gathering. We have, for instance, going on right now, a hypothesis that mankind is what causes climate change. We can observe the climate change happening. We can observe that the mean temperature of the Earth might undulate up or down, that ice ages or ages where the temperature is hotter and the ice caps melt and the oceans rise. We can observe that that has happened in the past, and it may be happening now. But the hypothesis that mankind is responsible in some way for that climate change, the experiments prove nothing. Nothing man can do or not do affects the temperature of the planet. The planet is enormously static. That is to say, it tries because of the vast array of of possibilities, there's an average that occurs. And mankind, all his thinkings and doings, all the drivings and everything that he can do is so tiny, so far down in the tail, what we call the tail conditions of the bell curve of energy on the earth, there is virtually no effect. So it does make for good rhetoric, because ostensibly then you could tax all of the developed countries, shave a little bit off the top for yourself, and evidently feed some to the underdeveloped countries, and thus save the planet. Makes for good politics, but for lousy science. So that's generally how the data is gathered, how science comes into it. When we talk about junk science, this is exactly what we're talking about.
Well said, Brooks. Who is Lucifer, and how was he able to gain control over the destiny of the human race?
It's a good question. Who is Lucifer? You're asking, you're asking me who he is. Uh, all I can tell you from what I've read in the history books and from the ancient records is that Lucifer is one of the powerful personalities in the universe. We have the Creator, which we can call God or the Father. We don't really know his name. He's been called Elohim. He's been called all kinds of names. I don't think that's really important what the name is. Then we have his offspring, or his creations in the spirit, and some of those have taken on flesh. Lucifer is one of the ones that evidently earned his way up to the light bringer. He was an angel. He was talented, beautiful, attractive, charismatic. Not that we don't see a lot of that on our planet already. And when higher man was created, higher Adam was created, we were created in a special image, in the image of the Creator. We were also given the ability to inherit everything. We were given two abilities that no other being on this earth has. First, we were given free will. We were given choice. We could choose to do or not do. We can hear the call, and we can choose not to respond or to respond. We're totally in charge of our own life condition. The second thing that we were given the ability to do is to observe and affect the universe. No other being on this planet has that ability. Go home today and try to teach your dog about tomorrow. You cannot do it. Not a whale, not a bird, not a fish. No animal understands yesterday or tomorrow. We do. And when we put our attention onto tomorrow, we can affect it. That's a creator class being. Now that creates, as we have seen in the ancient history and all of the ancient writings, all 44 of the major traditions on this planet. When the younger child is given the inheritance, is given the right to make an effect in the kingdom, so to speak, the older child feels left out, feels jealous, is driven to rage, and often murder. And this is exactly what we're seeing between the Lucifer class beings and the God class beings in the planet. So Lucifer knows that he cannot kill us because we're eternal. We are eternal beings having a mortal experience. And we may have many mortal experiences. But in this mortal experience, we're given the opportunity to advance way beyond where we came from. Lucifer wants us to choose him over the Creator, because he knows if he can do that, we then become part of him and not the other way around. And so with the battle that's going on right now for the minds, for the science, for the hearts, for the attention of all the beings on this planet, is between Lucifer, who's trying to get us to think about the solids of this world, to think about what's in it for me, who's going to support me, who's going to give me enough so that I can have a comfortable life. How can I abdicate the responsibility for my own care and feeding to somebody else who's going to take care of me? That's the Lucifer class being. The creator class being says, what can I become? What can I do? What can I dream? How far can I go? What can I discover? This, we're already seeing what I call in the birth trilogy, the grand division. These two classes of beings are being separated as we speak. It's happening right at this very minute. And once this chasm is clear, once this line is empty, and all the beings are on one side, all the beings on the other side, then the gathering will begin. The gathering of both sides together. And then the earth will come apart.
With this grand division that you speak of, and Joseph Farrell also, he talks about the ancient cosmic war that took place in the distant past. Do you think that there was a war in the heavens between good and evil that took place? And who do you think won that war? Because to me, Brooks, it's obvious that we're surrounded by evil, and that there has been a dark force on this planet that has had dominion over Earth for thousands of years. So I don't want to sound like a pessimist, but it seems like the evil dark force, whatever that is, has reigned Earth for thousands of years.
Well, modern history, written by the victors, obviously, people who have survived, who've managed to put pen to paper and their observations have propagated, has observed that Earth for about 5,000 years was basically ruled by one man. I mean, not the same man for 5,000 years, but one man at a time ruled the world with wooden ships, with his armies. If you were born a baker to a baker, you were a baker. You didn't suddenly become an architect. You didn't become a scientist. You didn't go to Vienna and become a physicist. It just didn't happen. The sovereign decided what every being on the planet got or didn't get. That's the way it was. And the future was written down for us already. We had scripture, all kinds of scripture written all over the planet. And mostly that's how people learn to read. They learn to read by being given the most printed books on the planet, which were these scriptures. And so they read about the future. They already knew that we were all going to march toward Armageddon. We were going to have this big battle, and God was going to come down, split the Mount of Olives. Jesus was going to wipe out all the evil people. The good people were going to be taken up in the clouds, and everybody was going to be burned to stubble. Everyone was looking forward to that day. But in 1770s, a group of men got together and said, basically, look, we already know that future. We've already read this future. It's supposed to be irrefutable. But they believed in their hearts that they could choose another future. So they got together and said, let's form a new government. We have this chance. We have this ocean between us. We're colonies. We can do what we want to do. Let's form a new nation that exists at our pleasure. And let's put it as its basis specific rights that are given to us, not from the king, but from God. And no one can take them away. Well, we fought a couple of wars over it, and we managed to squeak by. I don't know how, but we did. And now we have this amazing country that has changed the world. It's changing the universe. But that power that you talk about, that ruled this world for 5,000 years, they want it back. They want their world back, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. As I said, we've already fought wars. We've already lost millions of people, and they still have not won. Lucifer and his followers were originally in the Garden of Eden separated from higher Adam. You'll recall this argument that Lucifer had with God after he was called out, like, hey, what did you do to Eve? Eve immediately confesses, says, look, this is what happened. And so God said, all right, I'm going to try to clean up this mess. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to crawl on your belly for the rest of your days and eat dust. And that didn't sit too well. So he said, well, if you do that, if you curse me for the same thing that we do on every single world, then I'm going to take all the bodies that you make for Adam and Eve, and I'm going to possess them. And then God in the Bible, in Genesis, takes this amazing step. He creates what he calls enmity. He says, I will put enmity between thee and the seed of the woman. He'll have power. You'll have power to bruise his heel, and he'll have power to crush your head. In other words, it's our choice as to whether you take us or not. But I'm saying somehow, you're right, somehow Lucifer figured out how to get his spirits into physical bodies on this planet. I don't know exactly when it was done, but I can tell you, evil is born on this world. It is born evil. It grows up evil as a child. It is an evil young man. It is an evil adult. They enjoy hurting other people. They receive elation out of death and rape and murder and pain. And that is what we're fighting in this world right now.
Okay, Brooks, were we genetically engineered to the very code within our DNA? We talked about this a little while ago, but were we genetically engineered to the very code within our DNA to have certain limitations and flaws? In return, makes us like a slave race here on Earth for our creators. And maybe that is one reason why we have a hard time evolving consciously, spiritually, and technologically, because we had this damper within our genetic makeup to keep us from evolving.
When I think about the potential of the human soul, my feelings are that it's really unlimited. I think that when I look at mathematicians or musicians or artists or architects or philosophers, I can see that there really is no limit to what we can imagine. One of the things that limits a person is his access to knowledge. Now, for a long, long time, only those that really had access to libraries or to a good teacher in a one-room school or to a university could have access to this knowledge. In some respects, you could say knowledge was institutionalized. It was controlled by the sovereign, or it was controlled by government. Even, during Jimmy Carter's day, we decided to form the Department of Education because the federal government felt that some national standard had to be put in place because states were just not doing a good job of making sure that people were skilled enough and had enough knowledge to meet the demands of a modern society. Well, as it turns out, exactly the opposite happened. Instead of the federal government walking in and uh, supercharging the information system, they suppressed it. They, instead of textbook writers being able to say, well, let's approach calculus from this standpoint, or let's approach political science from this standpoint, or space exploration from this standpoint, and then we will teach kids not just to know, we will teach them how to learn. And so they will become eternal students, and then we'll see great things happen. Instead of that, a federal standard was created, a federal test was created. The teachers were, and the school systems were monetarily incentivized to teach to that standard. In other words, as long as you can pass the federal exam, you're going to be written a check. And so the textbooks were crafted to meet the federal standard. So now what you had is the federal government basically telling the student what they were going to learn. And that subject matter became approved by a special team of experts selected by the federal government that are going to make sure that you learn not how to learn, but how to work. It's a totally different philosophy. And then in 1996, something changed. In 1996, what we used to call the Watts line, or what was called the internet before that time, we could access it maybe with a dial-up modem if we were really lucky and had a good fast phone line. In 1996, high-speed internet was introduced, cable internet. All of a sudden now people had half a meg or 1 meg of access. And what happened was companies, schools, information providers began to establish websites. I was an engineer in those days, and we used to use what was called the Thomas Register. Thomas Register was a 24-volume set of big, thick green books, all in alphabetical order, that listed every item manufactured in America. Bearings and gaskets and coatings and all kinds of materials. So if I wanted to buy something like a linear actuator or a gasket or a tank, I could go through the Thomas Register, look up the companies that made that, send them a fax, they would send me back a quote, and that's how we built things. Everything was built that way, airplanes and buildings and manufacturing facilities. But in 1996, the companies in the Thomas Register, all those millions of names, began getting websites. I called Thomas Register and said, hey, what's going on? They said, well, about 5,000 companies a day are launching websites with their full catalogs on them. Now, the internet is an upgrade for my generation. You know, we started out with long distance charges on phones. We didn't know what a smartphone was. We didn't want to know how fast the computer was. We wanted to know, why do I need a computer? That's the question we were asking in those days. What did we do with it? There was nothing to do with it. We didn't know what a browser was. We didn't know what click meant. Well, the next generation, the internet's not an upgrade. It's hardwired to them. Now what we're beginning to see is not a physical evolution, but a mental evolution. And what's happened is society has changed. Now what we have is uninstitutionalized education. Now we have smart people, smart kids that are driven by their own will to learn as much as they can. They're outstripping universities by the time they're in 10th grade. By the time they're 20, they're the most brilliant minds that have ever walked the face of the earth. They know more than Einstein. They know more than Newton ever thought about knowing. And what's going to happen is that knowledge is going to start manifesting in things our society can do. That power that has been trying to take control of the world for all these centuries is losing its grip. And we're seeing that battle right now between that new consciousness, that new, I hesitate to use the word evolved human being, because it's more of a mental generation, and what they had in mind for the rest of the world. We still see that old guard, that sixth term senator, or that sovereign that's been worn the crown for 40 years, still trying to hold control of the earth. But they're about to lose it, because the internet is now not in the hands of millions of people. It's in the hands of billions of people. And that knowledge is going to change the earth forever.
And I don't want to kind of digress too much, but that is one reason why I think they are trying to do away, or try to get rid of the internet, or have guess, censor it, is to keep us from expanding our knowledge and our awareness.
Well, when the internet was first formed, it was by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. It was placed under what's called Class 1 status. Class 1 basically means it's an information service. The federal government is ordered under that class to have a light touch. That means they can't control the content. It can't control the speed. It has to let the market force evolve it the way it's going to evolve. The tech giants, the top 4 tech giants, have more money between them than all but 7 countries on the planet. That's how successful they have become. Now, they think that because they have so much money, because they have so much wealth, that they can shape this entire information system. They're wrong. Because it is not their money that makes the internet great. It's our will that makes the internet great. It's our ability to share knowledge one with another. Now, in the last presidency, there was an effort to move the internet from a Class 1 utility to a Class 2. Now, in Class 2, what happens to the internet? It becomes a federal utility. Now, under Class 2, the federal government can control through regulation what goes on that internet and what doesn't. Now, we're already seeing that in the private sector. We're seeing the private companies say, okay, this content can be on our service and this content cannot be on our service. That's the censorship you were talking about. We're going to let this political party say anything that it wants to, but we're going to not allow this political party to put their ideas on our service. They think that what that's going to do is shape the world in the way they want it to go. But what's going to happen is that other political, not the party, but the people that have an affinity toward that philosophy, that tradition, they're going to find another way to communicate. As long as the internet remains an information service where free market forces can make it be whatever it's going to be, then we remain free. The instant a government steps in and says, all this information, it's ours. Everything you think of, everything you do, every email you send, every text you type belongs to us. Then freedom is at an end.
Well said, Brooks. I meant to ask you this a while ago, and you kind of mentioned it. Are certain leaders across the world working alongside the Nephilim? And many people may say, who are the Nephilim? Now they could be. We mentioned last night. It could be a couple things. It could be just this force, almost like this spiritual force, or maybe it could be maybe a physical being that has this Nephilim genetic makeup within them. But are certain leaders across the world working alongside the Nephilim? I'm asking you this because it's a two-part question.
The answer is yes. One thing I know as an engineer, we have projects that sometimes span multiple generations. We have an engineer who creates something that begins building it, but he's not the engineer that finishes it. So the next engineer will come along and he'll put his spin on it. He'll say, oh, well, that bracket needs to be beefed up, or this needs to be straightened, or that angle needs to be changed, or wouldn't it be neat if we could do this? We're seeing it with airplanes, with cars, with bridges, with everything. But there are some things that don't change. From generation to generation, century to century, millennia to millennia, they stay exactly straight. The only way that that can occur is if the same being is in charge of that thing. The Nephilim class being is the only being on this planet that has that kind of lifespan. Now, there aren't very many of them. The records say there are 200, but there may be less than that. Some may be in prison, some may be out of power, some may be incapacitated in some way. So there's even less than 200 trying to influence a population of 7 billion, maybe 8 billion. So could they themselves, their full 12-foot non-human selves, step forward in front of the microphone on CNN and tell the world what to do? No, absolutely could not happen. A, we wouldn't follow it. B, it wouldn't obey the rules. Okay, we don't allow aliens to step forward and rule the world. But we could allow them to stay back in the shadows. We could call certain world leaders into the back room, let them meet this Nephilim, excuse me.
But Brooks, what I meant that the two-part question that I was kind of leading to, and you kind of set me up for the next question. How come the Nephilim haven't? How come they haven't taken over the world by force? What is their agenda? And instead of taking over by force, are they more incrementally, I guess, taking over the minds and consciousness of humanity?
The ancient record says the Nephilim were sent here to the world to watch over humanity. They were called the Watchers, or they were called the, angels that came to this earth to instruct man in certain things. And evidently, what happened is they became tempted or enraged with jealousy. Like, wait a minute, we're coming here to teach this being, and yet this being is going to eventually have a greater inheritance than we do. Well, evidently, this questioning of the mission left an opening for Lucifer to enlist their allegiance, and the angels fell. They fell and became involved with humanity. The ancient record says that they actually sexually became involved with humanity, created abominations, which eventually were wiped out in the flood. So the answer to your question is, yeah, they tried to get involved in humanity. They tried to change it in the days, before Noah. So now the world's wiped out and we start over again. So they say, okay, well, maybe that doesn't work. But how about if we control the world's money supply? Yeah, how about if we teach men how to use economics to control the progress and success of whole countries? And we certainly see that happening. A very complex system of economics. First, they pull us off the gold standard, then off the silver standard, then off the gold standard. Now they can just create money out of nothing, out of thin air. We can drive countries, entire countries, into debt that they cannot sustain, and we can break them. We can collapse the money supply and force them into a depression, destroying any hope of prosperity that they might have. So the answer is yes, they could come out in force and just start, destroying mankind. But as I said before, we're eternal beings. We come back. We continue on. They don't accomplish their goal. Their goal is to make us choose. In fact, their goal is to give us no choice but to choose their way. And that's the battle that's going on right now.
Well said, Brooks. I keep saying that, but you are stating everything very well. And I guess the next part, I guess it could be a three-part question with that. What do the world leaders get in return for working alongside the Nephilim? Did they sell their soul for riches and power?
Unfortunately, this oath and covenant that they make for the rewards of the flesh on this earth, maybe a long and prosperous life of wealth and debauchery, once you make so much money that you've eaten everything that can be eaten, you've worn everything that can be worn, you're making so much money you couldn't spend it if you stayed up 24 hours a day. Then it becomes about power. And then that power doesn't satisfy. it's interesting that we see in the news when we watch uh, the life and times of various famous people, they're pretty much miserable. In fact, almost to a person, because of this oath and covenant and the lifestyle that they've chosen, they're in pain. They're in pain all the time. And so they have to take drugs to dull down the senses of the physical body because the lifestyle that they're living puts them in such pain that they can't stand it. And you can only drink so much, you can only do so much opiates, and eventually it kills you. And that's what we're seeing.
All right, Brooks. If evil has dominion and control over life here on Earth, at least that's what it seems like. What do you think their agenda is, and what type of future do you think they are trying to steer us towards?
Well, they clearly have an agenda where they want us to choose to live their lifestyle. They want us to give up our inheritance. Not that they gain that inheritance, but they prevent us from getting it. And I think that's their goal. I don't think that they have control over this dominion. I think that we are sovereign beings and we can rule ourselves. You cannot imprison a free soul as long as a soul realizes that it's free. It's sort of like when you train a wild elephant to be a beast of burden. At first, they tie the elephant's ankle with a gigantic chain to a jobobo tree. And try as the elephant might, it can't uproot the tree. It might take a day, it might take a week, but eventually the elephant gives up. After that point, it only takes a small tether tied around that elephant's ankle to keep it captive, because the elephant never tries again. That's the difference between an elephant and a human being. We will always try to be free.
That's a good metaphor, Brooks. I guess, what steps do we need to take to break free of this dark tyrannical control over our minds and our consciousness?
That's a powerful question. It requires an awakening, but more than that, because a lot of people will go to a conference or they'll hear a song or meet a person who will arouse their faculties, who will make them think that maybe they can become more than what they are. Maybe they really aren't what people have been telling them they are their whole lives. But once that awakening occurs, it's sort of like the call. It's like, come out. Then it's up to us. Because you can take the awakening and you can go right back home and you can slip right back into that rut. You can get up, you can go to work, you can come home, you can watch the prescribed entertainment, and you can go right back to sleep. In other words, you could take the blue pill and go right back in. Once you receive the call, then it's up to you. And I will say, just from my own experience, that pathway is not easy. Sometimes there's hunger, sometimes there's pain and frustration and disappointment, and definitely, most definitely, failure. But that is how we learn. We fail and pick ourselves up and then succeed. We might fail 3, 4, 5 times, but I will say that eventually you learn what to do to overcome. And even if it's a small progress in your life, maybe you never become wealthy or rich, or maybe you never retire in comfort, but at least you're free. At least you have joy, which is something you will never have in captivity.
I actually meant to ask you this a while ago because that was a perfect way to end this segment right here. But I guess here's where this last question we're going to end this segment for this time. For just this part one of the discussion. I feel like religion, Brooks, is a major weapon at play when it comes to keeping us divided as a species because there's many religions throughout the world. And I don't want to be a pessimist again, but I don't think we are ready to give up our belief systems because these belief systems and these religions are keeping us divided throughout the world.
I make the assertion in my writings, my personal viewpoint of things, that the Nephilim are responsible for creating all religions, all of them. There was no religion ever established by the Creator. All religions were established by the Nephilim or the Nephilim class beings. The instant that religion is created and people are ascribed to it, they're immediately told to hate all other religions. It is a beautiful system of chaos that has kept us at war and division and mistrust and prejudice and discrimination our entire existence.